Hi, this is Miss Litton, and this is a very, very teeny, tiny review of Chapter 27, and this is Essential Understandings 1 through 5. So on this part, first thing you want to know is that the universe is about 20, maybe 13 billion years old, but the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. And as we talked about it, we started off just kind of reviewing about plate tectonics. So we learned about the core, and the heat generated by the core causes these what kind of currents? Convection currents. And then sitting on top of the mantle are what? Starts with a P, plates. And those plates can be oceanic or continental. And then these plates are gonna move due to these convection currents. And as a result of plates moving around, sometimes plates are going to be moving away from each other. What kind of boundary did we call that? Do you remember? A divergent boundary is when they move away from each other. And where did we see things like a divergent boundary? Seafloor spreading, right? So you're making new plate at that point, right? That oceanic plate is thinner. Okay, more dense, and it's newer. And then the continental plates, those are going to be thicker, right? And so just as much as you can have plates going away from each other, you can have plates going towards each other. And so we talked about those being called convergent boundaries. And if it's an oceanic plate meeting a continental plate, then who's going to win? That's like, remember I gave the example of if you had a motorcycle and you had a truck, who's going to win in that car accident? Truck. The truck's going to win. And the motorcycle is going to go under the truck, right? And catch on fire. Just like that oceanic plate is going to go underneath the continental plate and melt, right? And become part of that mantle again. Then you could have two continents coming together. And in that case, it's probably going to cause some kind of mountain, right? You could see volcanic activity where two plates come together, because at that subduction zone, that can be heated up by the mantle and then erupt. We also talked about transform boundary, when plates slide past one another. And when they do that, you could get some, what? Earthquakes, exactly. When we were talking about the age of some of these materials, because we said the oceanic plates are younger than the continental plates, we talked a little bit about absolute dating, and we also revisited that idea when we talked about fossils. And so, in absolute dating, scientists are aware of how fast certain isotopes break down. And so when you find a sample of rock that has it broken down, you can measure, well, how fast is the speed of which it breaks down, and we call that its what life? Half-life. So if I started out with this much of a sample, like when a rock is newly formed, so if you look at your ratio of white to blue, though this would be really too much, right? Our ratio of white to blue, if I find a rock that has this much, I know it's had one half-life, right? And whatever that might be for that particular rock. And then if I find it like this, I know it's had 2 half-lives. This would represent 3 half-lives. Another fold would be 4 half-lives. So when you find a rock, you look to see how much of that isotope is in there and its ratio, and you know how old that particular rock is. Okay? What else? Then we talked about that it was a unifying theory. We went over that. Oh, we talked about some evidence that you might look at is how the magnetism has been probably reversed a few times in the course of 4.5 billion years, the history of our planet. And so that gives you evidence of seafloor spreading. And we talked about how large bodies of water or glacier are going to be very, very what? Heavy. And that can cause like indentations, right, in the plates. And we talked about evidence for Pangaea as well, looking at mountain ranges where two continents come together, or when you look at those rings of fire like we talked about where you have volcanoes. We looked at fossils and how they're spread across continents that could only have existed if those continents were together. What kind of evidence is that for evolution? We talked about different evidence for evolution. What is it when you look at fossils? Starts with a B. Biogeographical evidence. Excellent. Okay. And looking at marks of glacier and glacier movement, kind of the scratches, the scars on the Earth's continental plates are also evidence of Pangaea. And when we look at the history of Earth, one of the things we want to see is that the Earth's environment, whatever you're starting out with, that's going to affect what life is there. And then once that life starts going, it can affect the Earth's environment. So they kind of give feedback one to the other. So at first, the early Earth's environment was a reducing environment, no free oxygen. But as life started evolving, all of a sudden oxygen became in the Earth. And that affected what organisms could be on the Earth. And that in turn, they affected the climate of the Earth. So that was that last section on plate tectonics, is how the geologic cycle can affect life cycles. Okay, turn to the person next to you, ask them, do you have clarifying questions on that first part? Anything you want me to go over? Anything on the Shadowlands on any of that? I talked about all of that. Okay, we good? Did I go too fast on that? All right. So now let's move on to the story of life on Earth. And so we already talked about that early Earth had no free oxygen in it. There could be oxygen that's wrapped up with water, H2O, right? But no O2. And the early Earth's environment probably mimicked the same kind of gases that you would find coming out of a volcano. Why would that be from what we've already just talked about? Why would we see gases out of the volcano? Due to plate tectonics and its subduction zones, right? That when like the oceanic crust goes underneath the continental plate, that causes what to happen? Magma is going to come up as volcanoes, and so the gases that you would see out of volcanoes are probably the same gases you would see on Earth because of those continents or those plates moving around. Yes?
So for every type of like plate tectonic movement, does magma come out, or like does it?
Let's think of it when it would and when it wouldn't. Okay? So if you have a subduction zone, it could be two oceanic plates, and one would go under the other. You can have volcanoes, and that's how an island could start in the middle of the water, or a subduction zone where you have an oceanic plate meeting a continental plate. You'll have volcanoes on Earth, right? Where's a place where you could have two plates but no volcanoes? Divergent, right? You might not have a volcano there, right? Because they're going away from each other.
But you wouldn't have like a volcano, but like would stuff come out?
Stuff would be coming out, right?
Okay.
So you would have maybe like hydrothermal vents and things like that in those areas, but not necessarily a volcano because it's going to cool and harden. Okay, good question. So early Earth, those gases might look something like this that you would have to start out with. And so you go, okay, this is early Earth, these are the gases, how could life have formed? Well, a man named Oparin did an experiment. He says, I bet if we took these gases, that if you gave those gases a source of energy, that you could synthesize organic molecules from those gases. And a man named Miller said, you know what, I'm going to give that a try. So he took those gases and he packaged them up, okay? He packaged them up into this apparatus, and we have heat down here. What could that represent? What kind of energy? Magma, good. He put electric sparks up here. What could that represent? Lightning. Okay, and he cycled the gases like what you would get out of a volcano. He cycled them for about a week. And after a week's time, he took these inorganic molecules, and lo and behold, he had these organic molecules, which would be step one on our evolution towards life in just 1 week's time. Now, the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, and life is about 3.5 billion years old. So how much time took place? About 1 billion, right, years in order to go from inorganic to a living cell. Well, the first step is just making organic molecules, and he did that in how long? 1 week's time. He was able to form organic molecules. So that takes us to this right here. And stepping up from inorganic molecules, like what we would see out of a volcano, we're trying to, our first step is to make organic molecules, our building blocks. What's this right here? What building block is that? An amino acid, okay? So we want to make things like amino acids and simple sugars and fatty acids. These are our bricks. In our earlier analogies when we learned these are our bricks to build our what? Walls. And our walls in this case are macromolecules. And our you know your 4 important organic molecules: proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids. So you know if you want a protein, you need to have amino acids. If you want carbohydrates, you need simple sugars. If you want to have nucleic acids, you need to have nucleotides. Where would these have come from? The gases from the volcano, if you supplied them with energy, will form these organic molecules. Where is that energy coming from? Magma, lightning, UV, what? Radiation, radioactive isotopes giving off energy. So if you have that energy, you can build organic molecules. If you have organic molecules, then the idea is that same energy could be used to build these important organic molecules. Or things like surfaces of clay, the minerals that are in clay can act as catalysts, inorganic catalysts, to facilitate the building, let's say, of proteins. And that you can also reproduce. Once we have these organic molecules, we need to put them together to build a cell. Well, one of the first things you would need to have is you'd need to have an outer membrane, right? That outer membrane. Are you guys looking for your tests? Because you want to look at them? They're all right in here. So I don't have them pulled out, so will you put them neatly back when you're done? Okay, there we go. You can take it back there if you want to. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is have a barrier. So what goes in, what's happening inside the cell is different than what goes outside the cell. What is a cell membrane built out of? Phospholipid bilayer, right? What do we have in a phospholipid bilayer? We have lipids and proteins. Good job. Lipids and proteins. So we know if we can combine these lipids and proteins together, maybe we can build a cell membrane. Okay? And those membranes could be membranes that go, and allow for cellular respiration or photosynthesis. And our first cell is probably a what kind of cell? A prokaryotic or eukaryotic cell? Prokaryotic, because it's simpler. And do you think it's an autotroph or a heterotroph? What's easier, to just consume nutrients or make the nutrients and then use them? Yeah, just consuming is easier, right? So probably the first organisms were heterotrophs, and all they did is eat things, consume them. And then eventually one of those early organisms was able to take energy from the sunlight and convert it to make something nutritious. And then you could then have the steps of photosynthesis evolve. So probably the first step was I can't remember if I put anything out here. I did not. Okay. Was a prokaryotic heterotroph. So when we look through, you have your early Earth, you have all of these forms of energy to form organic molecules. We also talked about that you would probably run out of nitrogen, ammonium. So iron nickel sulfides at hydrothermal vents would be able to convert N2 into NH3, which would be ammonia, or NH4 ammonium. We talked about that you could form macromolecules with that same energy, or you could use clay as a catalyst in order to do that. And in fact, there are these things called proteinoid microspheres. A man named Fox saw these. And this is when you take hot proteins and you cool them. They will form these spheres. And operans coacervate droplets. These are like fatty layers. And our first cell membrane was a combination between those two. And then our first life form would be about, about 3.6 billion years old, like I said, a prokaryote and probably a heterotroph. And then when you look at this picture, it's showing you those same steps we're going up on steps to life. Early Earth to your inorganic molecules that came out of probably what? Volcanoes. To small organic molecules. Why, thank you. Small organic molecules and your macromolecules and your early cells and then a self-replicating cell. Okay, and that takes us up our steps to life. Any clarifying questions on that part? You want to go over? Okay, keep going. And then the next thing we talked about was evidence for evolution. I'm just making sure I'm going through everything. Yeah, this was the last thing. Yeah, this is the last part for your quiz, is evidence for evolution. So when you look at these pictures now in review, right, you could probably tell me more about them. So this one would represent what?
Fossils.
Fossils, okay? And what do you need to be a fossil? How old do you need to be? What?
10,000.
10,000 years old. What kind of fossils do we have? Petrified wood, found in amber, right? So we, what?
Like bones, I guess.
Bones, right? We talked about molds and casts. Do you remember all of those? Okay. Footprints, imprints, those are all fossils. And one thing that you see when you look at the fossil record is that organisms went from more simple to more, C7?
Yeah.
Okay, from more simple to more what? Complex, and that you would need transitional forms. You would look for those transitional forms. And one part that we talked about it is, to be a fossil is actually quite difficult. Because you, have to be what? Soft or hard usually to be a fossil? Yeah, something hard that can be fossilized. And you have to be in the conditions that allow you to be fossilized and not torn apart and eaten by some kind of predator or something. So you have to be in the conditions of that. And then you have to be a fossil, you're like 10,000 years old. So you have to withstand all of the geologic changes that happen on that early Earth. And then you have to be found by a human. So it takes a lot to be a fossil. And we looked at equus, we looked at the horse in that transitional form. We also looked at Pangaea and biogeographical evidence. We've already talked a little bit about that, but we also mentioned that organisms will survive and reproduce in an area that they're adapted to. And so that's why you only see certain organisms in certain locations. But why would you ever see a salamander in Antarctica? Why would you see a salamander fossil in Antarctica?
Because like it used to be
Yeah, used to be what? An area where it was what?
like hot.
Hotter. And that is evidence of then continental drift. We looked at anatomical, it's so annoying, I have to like cover it. We looked at anatomical pieces of evidence, and there were 3. Do you remember the 3 pieces of anatomical evidence? One starts with an H. You looking at your notes?
The homologous structures.
Right, homologous structures, and that's what you're seeing right here. Similar bone structure points to a common ancestor. Now you may not do the same things with it. The whale is swimming, the cat is walking on it, I am grabbing my smoothie. We're all using it in different ways, but the important thing is we have the same structure, which means we probably have a common ancestor. What was another piece of anatomical evidence?
Vestigial.
What's a vestigial structure? Think maybe about a penguin. What does he have? Okay, and what were they? They were wings. Okay, does he fly with them now? No, he doesn't. What does he do with them now? He swims. You can come to all my reviews, smart boy. But he swims with them now, but that points to his ancestral past. You know that penguin probably had an ancestor who had wings that could fly. And I gave you an example about whales having a hip bone and part of a femur. We looked at salamanders who have vestigial eyes, which probably means they were outside where there was light, even though now they're found in a cave where there is no light. They have remnants of those eyes. So that's a vestigial structure. And the last one is looking at little, with an E before you're a baby, embryos, comparing embryos. And the more similar the embryonic development, probably the more closely you are related. Okay, we also looked at the geologic time scale and dating. And if you remember our geologic time scale, what era are we in right now?
The last.
Cenozoic, good. The center of your world now, right? And that goes from now, and what do you, how fast can you drive your car? 65. So it goes back to 65 million years ago, the Cenozoic era, okay? And before the Cenozoic era was the Mesozoic in the middle, and it ended 65 million years ago, but it started about the time that school's out. Yeah, so somewhere in the 245, 248, somewhere in there. And then it depends on what book you're looking at. And then the Paleozoic era came before that, and that's about dinner time. Yeah, so you're in the 540s or so for that. And then before that was called Precambrian. And it was called Precambrian because the first period of the Paleozoic era is the Cambrian. Yeah. And then all I expect you to do is to know the bookmarks of life on either end, and then hopefully you'll be able to answer any questions on that. So beginning of time was 4.6 billion years ago, up to Precambrian ended around, in the fives, okay, 500 million years ago. So we went from no life all the way up to those that don't have, and so you call those what? Invertebrates. We went up to invertebrates. And the simplest of all those plants we were looking at starts with an A? Algae. I can see you were trying to say it. That's where you end in the the Precambrian. Then in the Paleozoic era, we start with algae, but we get all the way up to, we go through mosses, Christmas trees, and Hanukkah bushes, known as gymnosperms. So you go from algae to gymnosperms. That's a huge, lot of changes happening in the Paleozoic era. And then animals went from invertebrates all the way up to early reptiles. You look like a rat. Well, you can review this part. But then the Mesozoic era, you go from early reptiles to early what you are. Mammals. And plants went from gymnosperms up to early angiosperms, flowering. Give some flowers to Angie. Flowering plants to Angie. Angiosperms. This is how my class works, if you haven't figured it out yet. And then the Cenozoic era is angiosperms to herbs and early mammals to man. Okay, so you want to be familiar with that. And then last but not least is biochemical. And this is the one that's used most today. And you had a POGL about it as well. And you're comparing DNA sequences or sequences of amino acids and proteins in order to see who's related to who. And when you put an organization scheme on it as a model, it's called a phylogenetic tree when you're looking at your evolutionary history. And when we line that up, you talked about learning how to make a cladogram. Yeah, a cladogram. So I went through a lot there in just a few pictures, but if you looked at, this is an example of a cladogram. And so when you look at this diagram right here, everybody but the hagfish has what? Jaws. And you just start dropping them off, you know? And so if I was going to talk about the mouse and the chimp, I would say they both have jaws, they both have lungs, they both have claws or nails, they both have fur, they both have mammary glands. So the more similar they are, the more closely related they are. They're more distantly related to a salamander and even more distantly related to a fish. Okay, because they have things in common, more things in common with a salamander and a lizard than they do a fish. And so that's setting up a cladogram. But the way it's set up today is by looking at similarities in amino acid sequencing, and this is a lot like your POGL that you did, and looking at the number of differences, or looking at DNA or genes in order to set up your cladogram. And that was it. Bunch of days, but do you have any questions, anything you want me to go over?
Wait,
Yes.
Is the top graph, is that the same type of thing as when it's tilted?
Yes, it's just a different way to show it.
Okay.
And sometimes they have them tilting off to the left too, and that drives me nuts because I want to read left to right, not the other way around, yeah.
Okay.
But what you want to say is that the bottlenose dolphin and the orca are more closely related. The last time they had a common ancestor is right here.
And then they branch out.
Yeah, and when's the last time the sperm whale and the dolphin had a common ancestor? See it right here? So here's your sperm whale, okay, and if we follow the dolphin back, here's the last time they had a common ancestor. And if I say, which time did the bottlenose dolphin and the cow have a common ancestor, I gotta go all the way back to here is when they had a common ancestor. Okay, and so I would expect more differences between bottlenose dolphin and the cow than the bottlenose dolphin and the sperm whale. All right, good? Okay, you're super smart. I hope you studied for your quiz. Love you very much. Have a piece of toast.